I sat at the kitchen table, stirring my coffee and trying not to look at my father as he fumbled with his words. I just, I thought it'd be nice to have someone around. It's been hard for me since your mother passed, Maya. His eyes darted to the floor, unable to meet mine. His voice had a pleading quality, the way it always did when he wanted me to understand something he knew I wouldn't like. I wanted to be happy for him. I did. But I knew something was wrong from the way he spoke, as though he were more ashamed than excited. You're getting married? The words tasted strange coming out of my mouth. My father's girlfriend, Charlotte, was cold and distant, and I had met her only a handful of times. I could never put my finger on what exactly I didn't like about her. Maybe it was her eyes, which seemed to take in every detail but never gave anything away. Or maybe it was the way she always seemed to be one step ahead, like she'd anticipated every possible reaction. He nodded slowly. I know it's sudden, but she's wonderful, Maya. And it's not just for me. She's someone who could be here for you, too. A mother figure. A mother figure. The idea turned my stomach. My mother had only been gone for 2 years. I missed her every single day, and the idea of some stranger walking into her role made me feel like my heart was being hollowed out. But my dad was looking at me with those eyes, desperate for me to say something that would make him feel better. I swallowed my anger and forced a smile. I just want you to be happy, Dad. The wedding was small and fast. Barely any guests. Charlotte wore a sleek, off-white dress that made her look more like a statue than a bride. The whole thing felt clinical, like it was just another box she had to check off. Afterward, she smiled at me with that cold, thin-lipped expression that didn't reach her eyes. I hope we can be close, Maya, she said. I forced a nod, knowing deep down she had no intention of being close to me at all. The changes started small. At first, Charlotte would give me little tasks to do around the house, things she insisted would help me build character. Taking out the trash, loading the dishwasher, folding laundry. It seemed harmless, and I wanted to be helpful, so I didn't think too much of it. But every time I did something, she'd find a flaw in it. The laundry wasn't folded right, the dishes had water spots, or the trash hadn't been taken out quickly enough. One afternoon, I heard her talking to my dad in the living room. "She's spoiled, Alan," she said in that same icy tone she always used with me. "It's good for her to learn responsibility." I waited, holding my breath, hoping he'd defend me. But all I heard was his quiet agreement. "You're right. She does need to learn a little discipline." My stomach twisted, and I had to grip the wall to keep myself from falling over. He hadn't even tried to argue. It was as if he'd completely forgotten who I was. As time passed, Charlotte's demands grew harsher. Every morning, there'd be a new list of chores waiting for me on the fridge, written in her perfect cursive handwriting. Clean the floors, dust the furniture, weed the garden. And the punishments if I missed something were immediate and cruel. "If you can't manage simple tasks, Maya, maybe you don't deserve your allowance," she'd say with a smile that didn't match the harshness in her voice. I tried to talk to Dad about it once. "She's just trying to help you grow up," he said, not even looking up from his laptop. "Charlotte's been kind enough to take you under her wing. You should appreciate that." Kind enough. I felt like I was slowly disappearing from my own home. The house, the place I'd grown up in, was starting to feel like a prison, and every time I looked at my father, he seemed further away, lost in Charlotte's shadow. Then one day, Charlotte decided I should move rooms. "Victoria needs more space," she announced, referring to her own daughter, who was a few years younger than me. "It's only fair that you take the smaller room." I was stunned. My room, I had lived in that room my whole life. It was the only place in the house where I felt even a shred of comfort. "Don't argue, Maya," she said sharply. "It's not as though you're entitled to it." Dad didn't say anything. He stood there, silent, not meeting my eyes, as though he were ashamed but too weak to stand up for me. It was like I was invisible, like my feelings didn't matter at all. I moved my things into the basement the next day, into a cramped little room that felt more like a storage closet than a bedroom. The walls were cold, and there was a single, tiny window that let in hardly any light. I spent hours down there, staring at the walls, wondering how I'd ended up in this nightmare. Things only got worse. Charlotte monitored everything I did. I couldn't even go out with my friends without her interrogating me first. Who are you going with? How long will you be gone? And no matter what I said, she'd give me that same disapproving look and tell me to make better choices. One day, she called me into the living room where she sat beside Dad, who looked uncomfortable. Maya, she began, your grades have been slipping. We need to talk about priorities. I felt my face heat up, a mix of anger and embarrassment flooding through me. I've been doing the best I can, I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. It's hard with everything you've been asking me to do around here. She raised an eyebrow, feigning innocence. Oh, are you saying I'm to blame for your poor performance? Perhaps I've given you too much freedom. I wanted to scream, to tell her how much she was ruining my life. But I looked at my dad, hoping he'd see the pain in my eyes and finally stand up for me. But he just stared at the floor, nodding at whatever Charlotte said. Charlotte only wants what's best for you, Maya, he murmured, his voice barely audible. Every ounce of trust one had in him shattered in that moment. He had chosen her over me, over his own daughter. Days turned into weeks, and every moment in that house felt like a battle. Charlotte and Victoria treated me like a stranger, a nuisance that was getting in their way. I'd become the family maid, invisible, unnoticed. I started staying late at school just to avoid going home. My teachers noticed, and I could tell they wanted to ask if something was wrong, but I was too embarrassed to tell them the truth. One day, during the family dinner, Charlotte cleared her throat and gave me a long, calculating look. I have some news, she announced with a smile that was all teeth. Your father and I are expecting a baby. The room spun. A baby. This wasn't a family, it was her family. I was just the outsider, a placeholder until her own real child came along. I could see it in her eyes, the satisfaction in her smile. This was the final step in erasing me from my own life. Charlotte's cruelty ramped up after that. She hardly spoke to me unless it was to bark orders. You can start helping with the nursery, she instructed one day, handing me a paintbrush and expecting me to transform a plain room into a perfect nursery. I spent hours painting, my hands aching as I worked, her voice echoing in my ears every time I dared take a break. The worst part was watching my dad. He was wrapped around Charlotte's finger, oblivious to everything she put me through. His silence was a constant reminder that I was alone. Every day, I felt myself slipping further into a void, like my very existence was being chipped away piece by piece. And then it happened. One evening, Charlotte called me into the living room. She sat beside my father, both of them staring at me with identical looks of disappointment. We've been talking, Maya, she began, her voice dripping with feigned regret. With the baby coming, we need more space. I'm sure you understand. My heart pounded in my chest as I looked between them, desperate to see any sign of remorse, any hint that this was some kind of misunderstanding. But my father just stared at the floor, silent as ever. You should start thinking about finding somewhere else to stay, she continued smoothly, as if she were telling me the weather forecast. It'll be best for everyone. I looked to my dad one last time, hoping, praying he'd stand up for me. But he wouldn't even meet my eyes. I stood outside, the cold seeping through my thin jacket as I clutched the small suitcase they'd let me keep. It was filled with a few pieces of clothing and whatever I could grab in the short time they gave me to pack. No money, no place to go, and definitely no one to call. I looked back at the house one last time, wondering how it had come to this, how the place I'd grown up in, the place where every memory of my mom lingered, had become nothing but a dark silhouette against the night sky. With no other choice, I started walking. My feet carried me down familiar streets that suddenly felt foreign. I ended up at a nearby park and sat on one of the benches, shivering as I tried to process everything. I pulled my phone out of my pocket, scrolling through my contacts, but there was no one I felt comfortable calling. Most of my friends had drifted away over the past year. Charlotte's rules kept me from seeing them, and they stopped asking after a while. I couldn't imagine calling any of them now, not with this kind of news. I spent that first night on the park bench, curling up as best I could against the freezing air. Sleep came in short, fitful bursts, interrupted by sounds of passing cars, the crunch of footsteps, and the overwhelming emptiness that gnawed at me from the inside. When morning finally broke, I felt like a shadow of myself, exhausted and numb. For the next few days, I drifted from place to place, trying to find somewhere I could stay. I went to the school library during the day, pretending I was studying or doing research, anything to keep warm and to stay off the streets. I learned to wash up in the school bathroom, trying to keep myself looking as normal as possible, even though I could feel myself wearing down with each passing hour. At night, I found a nearby shelter, but it was cramped and filled with people who looked even more lost than I felt. The beds were just thin mats on the floor, and the smell of mildew and damp blankets hung heavy in the air. But it was better than the park, and I was grateful for any place that offered even a little bit of safety. After a few weeks, I managed to find a job at a small diner on the edge of town. The owner, a woman named Carla, didn't ask too many questions, which was a relief. She seemed to understand that I needed work, and that was enough for her. I started washing dishes, mopping floors, doing anything that would earn me a few dollars. The pay was low, but I held on to every cent, knowing I had to build some kind of foundation if I was ever going to make it on my own. Life at the diner became my new normal. I worked as many hours as I could, staying late to help Carla close up when she needed it. Over time, she started giving me small tips, a few extra dollars here and there. It wasn't much, but it was enough to buy a few essentials: a warm sweater, a secondhand backpack, and a few toiletries. Despite the long hours, there was something comforting about the diner. It was busy enough that I could blend in, and the people who came through didn't ask questions or give me pitying looks. I liked being invisible, working hard without anyone questioning who I was or why I was there. It was the first time in a long time that I felt a sense of peace, a place where I could exist without feeling judged or unwanted. One evening, as I was cleaning up, Carla came over and handed me a steaming cup of tea. "You've been working hard, Maya. You deserve a little break." I took the cup gratefully, wrapping my hands around it to soak up the warmth. "Thank you," I murmured, my voice barely a whisper. She sat down across from me, watching me carefully. "You know, I don't know much about your situation, and I won't pry. But if you ever need help or just someone to talk to, I'm here." Her kindness felt like a lifeline, and for the first time in weeks, I felt the weight of everything hit me all at once. Tears blurred my vision, and I had to bite my lip to keep from breaking down. But Carla just nodded, giving me a soft, understanding smile that made me feel like maybe, just maybe, I wasn't completely alone in the world. Over the next few months, things slowly began to improve. I saved up enough to rent a tiny room in a rundown apartment building. It wasn't much, just a single bed, a small window, and peeling wallpaper, but it was mine. For the first time since I'd been thrown out, I felt a flicker of hope. The room was shabby and the neighborhood wasn't exactly safe, but I didn't care. It was a start, a place where I could finally build something for myself. I started taking classes at the community center nearby, learning basic skills that could help me find a better job. They had courses on everything from computer skills to customer service, and I threw myself into them with everything I had. Every day was a struggle, juggling work at the diner with classes, but I was determined to create a life I could be proud of. As I settled into my new routine, I began to notice small changes within myself. I felt stronger, more resilient. I was no longer the girl who had been kicked out of her home, abandoned by her own father. I was someone new, someone who had survived. And as the weeks passed, I found myself letting go of the bitterness, the anger that had once consumed me. I didn't think about Charlotte or my father often, but every now and then, their faces would drift into my mind. I would remember the way they looked at me, as though I were nothing more than a burden, a stain on their perfect life. But each time the memory surfaced, I forced myself to focus on the present, on the life I was building for myself, far away from their cruelty. One evening, as I was finishing my shift at the diner, I overheard a conversation at the counter. A group of customers was talking about a local scandal, some wealthy couple whose finances had crumbled practically overnight. The wife was pregnant and had become a social pariah, and the husband was rumored to be on the verge of losing his job. My heart skipped a beat as I recognized the names. It was Charlotte and my father. I stood there, frozen, the mop handle clenched tightly in my hands. The news sent a rush of emotions through me: vindication, relief, and, strangely enough, sadness. Despite everything they had done, some part of me still felt the sting of loss, the ache of being cast aside by the people who were supposed to love me most. Carla noticed my reaction and placed a gentle hand on my shoulder. "Are you okay, Maya?" I nodded, swallowing hard. "Yeah, just hearing about someone I used to know." She didn't press me further, just gave me a knowing look and a soft squeeze before heading back to the counter. As I walked home that night, I felt a strange sense of closure, like a chapter of my life was finally ending. The people who had caused me so much pain were now facing the consequences of their actions, and I was here, standing on my own 2 feet, stronger than I'd ever been. But as much as I wanted to leave them in the past, a part of me wondered if they would reach out. I thought about them as I walked home, their faces haunting me in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. It had taken so much to push my father and Charlotte out of my mind, to bury the anger and hurt deep enough that I could finally breathe. But now, hearing that their perfect life was crumbling, it was like they'd clawed their way back in, refusing to let me go. I wanted to be relieved, to feel some sort of twisted satisfaction that karma had finally come for them. But instead, I just felt hollow. Back at my tiny apartment, I tossed my bag onto the floor and sank down on the bed, pulling my knees up to my chest. It was strange, this life I'd built. Strange, but mine. I'd learned to live with the loneliness, to find comfort in the quiet moments when it was just me and the steady hum of the city outside my window. And somehow, I'd come to accept that this was enough. I didn't need them. Not anymore. But the memories refused to stay buried. I remembered the day they threw me out, the cold finality in Charlotte's voice, the way my father wouldn't even look at me. The hurt flared up fresh, like a wound I'd been pretending was healed, and I realized just how deeply their betrayal had scarred me. I thought I'd gotten over it, that I'd moved on, but maybe I'd just built walls around the pain and told myself they didn't exist. A few days passed, and I went about my usual routine, trying to ignore the feelings that kept creeping up. I worked my shifts at the diner, attended my classes, and tried to keep my mind focused on the life I was building. But every time I looked up at the sound of the bell above the diner's door, I half expected to see my father's face, worn and desperate, begging me for help. The thought was absurd, but it haunted me all the same. Then, one evening as I was walking home, I felt my phone buzz in my pocket. I pulled it out, and my breath caught when I saw the caller ID. It was my father. I stared at the screen, my heart hammering in my chest as I debated whether or not to answer. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to keep walking and pretend that I hadn't seen his name flash across the screen. But another part of me, a part one hated to admit existed, longed to hear his voice. After a few rings, I pressed accept and held the phone to my ear, my voice barely above a whisper. "Hello." There was a pause on the other end, and then I heard his voice, strained and hesitant. "Maya, it's me. I know it's been a long time." I swallowed, trying to keep my voice steady. "What do you want?" He hesitated, and I could almost feel his discomfort through the phone. "Maya, I know I don't deserve anything from you. Not after what I did. But I need to talk to you. Please." I felt a surge of anger, mixed with something else I couldn't quite identify. "Talk. Now you want to talk. After everything?" "I know," he said, his voice cracking. "I know I've hurt you in ways I can't even begin to make up for. But things have changed. We've lost everything, Maya. Charlotte, she's not doing well. And I don't know what else to do." I felt a bitter laugh escape my lips. "So, you finally need me? Now that you're desperate?" "It's not like that," he insisted, but I could hear the desperation in his voice. "I made mistakes, Maya. Horrible mistakes. I see that now. But please just give me a chance to explain." Every part of me screamed to hang up, to walk away, and let him suffer the way he'd made me suffer. But something in his voice stopped me. Maybe it was the vulnerability, the rawness that I'd never heard before. Or maybe it was just the tiny, broken piece of me that still wanted to believe he cared, even after everything. Fine, I said, my voice cold and hard. We can meet, but don't expect forgiveness. He agreed, and we set a time and place for the next day. As I hung up, I felt a mix of dread and anticipation swirling in my stomach. I didn't know what I was hoping for: closure, maybe, or some kind of explanation that would finally help me make sense of everything. But part of me feared that meeting him would just reopen old wounds I'd barely managed to patch up. The next day, I found myself sitting alone in a small coffee shop, waiting for him to arrive. I stared down at my hands, twisting them nervously as the minutes ticked by. I told myself I was ready for this, that I was strong enough to face him. But now, sitting here, I felt like that lost, scared girl all over again. When he finally walked in, I barely recognized him. His face was gaunt, his hair grayer than I remembered, and his shoulders slumped under the weight of some unseen burden. He spotted me and approached slowly, as if he were afraid I might bolt at any moment. He sat down across from me, folding his hands on the table and looking at me with eyes that were filled with something I couldn't quite place: remorse, maybe, or guilt. Maya, he said softly, you look well. I wanted to laugh, to tell him how ridiculous that sounded coming from him. But I kept my expression neutral, refusing to give him the satisfaction of knowing how much this hurt. Why are you here, Dad? He sighed, looking down at his hands. I know I've failed you, Maya. I let Charlotte manipulate me, let her convince me that you were the problem. And now that everything's fallen apart, I see how wrong I was. I clenched my fists, my anger bubbling up as I listened to him try to justify himself. You chose her over me. You threw me out of my own home. Do you have any idea what that did to me? He winced, his face contorted with shame. I know, Maya. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. But Charlotte, she's in a bad way. The pregnancy was hard on her, and after everything that happened with our finances, she's not herself anymore. I stared at him, my heart hardening with each word. So that's what this is about. You want me to help her. The same woman who made my life hell, who manipulated you into throwing me out. And now, when she's suffering, you think I'm just going to drop everything and come running? He shook his head, his voice desperate. No, it's not like that. I just, I need to know if there's anything I can do to make this right, to prove that I'm sorry. I looked away, feeling the weight of his words settle heavily on me. I wanted to believe him, to let myself feel some small shred of compassion. But the memories were too fresh, too raw. The hurt he'd caused ran deeper than any apology could reach. I don't know if you can make this right, Dad, I said quietly. Some things, they leave scars that don't heal. I've spent the last year trying to rebuild my life, trying to forget everything you and Charlotte put me through. And now you want me to forgive and forget. He looked down, defeated. I don't expect forgiveness, Maya. But if there's any part of you that can find it in your heart to help us, even just a little, I'd be forever grateful. For a long moment, I just sat there, staring at him, feeling the weight of his plea pressing down on me. Part of me wanted to walk away, to leave him there in that coffee shop and never look back. But another part, the part that still longed for some kind of connection, felt torn. I'll think about it, I finally said, my voice barely above a whisper. But don't expect me to be the person I was before. That girl, she doesn't exist anymore. He nodded, a flicker of understanding in his eyes. I know. And I'm so sorry, Maya, for everything. I stood up, pushing my chair back, and turned to leave. As I walked away, I felt a strange sense of relief, like a weight had finally lifted from my shoulders. I didn't know if I'd ever be able to forgive him, but for the first time, I felt like I was the one in control. As I stepped out onto the street, I took a deep breath, the crisp air filling my lungs. I didn't have all the answers, but I knew one thing for certain. Whatever happened next, I would face it on my own terms. Walking away from that coffee shop, I felt both drained and strangely free. Meeting my father had forced open the wounds I'd been trying to ignore, but it had also reminded me how far I'd come. I didn't know him or Charlotte anything. They had been the ones to walk away from me first, and now that they needed something, they expected me to be there, to pick up the broken pieces they'd left behind. I knew I didn't want to step back into their world, even if part of me still wrestled with guilt over refusing to help. I threw myself back into my routine, clinging to the work that had helped me build my new life. The diner, my classes, my small, rented room, they weren't much, but they were mine, and they felt more like home than my father's house ever had after my mother died. I realized that I had finally created a life that was solid, stable. I had no intention of letting anyone, especially my father and Charlotte, ruin that for me. A few days later, I was at the diner washing dishes when Carla walked in with her usual calm, warm presence. She'd been a rock for me in so many ways, even though she barely knew the details of my life. I could tell she sensed I'd been going through something. Her quiet support was exactly what I needed. "How's everything going, Maya?" she asked, her voice as gentle as ever. I shrugged, trying to keep my tone light. "Same old, I guess." She gave me a knowing look, wiping her hands on her apron as she leaned against the counter. "You know, if you ever need to talk, I'm here. I know life doesn't always go the way we want it to." For a second, I almost told her everything. About my dad, about Charlotte, about how they'd left me stranded and how now they were the ones asking for help. But I kept it inside, giving her a small, grateful smile instead. "Thanks, Carla. That means a lot." As the weeks passed, I kept working, saving every dollar I could. I didn't hear from my father again, and I tried to convince myself that I was relieved. But the truth was, the silence gnawed at me. Despite everything, there was still a part of me that wished things could have been different. I wondered how they were managing, if they were still in that big, empty house, or if things had gotten even worse. Then one evening, just as I was closing up the diner, I saw him. My father stood outside, looking even more worn than the last time I'd seen him. His face was drawn and pale, his shoulders hunched, as if the weight of the world had finally caught up to him. I wanted to ignore him, to pretend I hadn't seen him standing there. But something kept me rooted to the spot, watching as he slowly made his way inside. He looked around, his eyes landing on me, and I could see the mixture of relief and shame that crossed his face. "Maya," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know I'm the last person you want to see, but please can we talk?" I took a deep breath, feeling a surge of anger and pity tangled together. "What do you want now?" He looked down, his hands twisting nervously. "It's Charlotte. She's not doing well, Maya. Ever since the baby, things have gone downhill. She's been struggling with her health, and we don't have anyone else. I don't have anyone else." I felt the bitterness rise in my throat. "You had me, but you threw me away the second she told you to." He flinched, nodding slowly. "I know, and I'll regret that for the rest of my life. But I'm asking for your forgiveness. Or if not forgiveness, then at least your help." I wanted to turn him away, to tell him he'd made his bed, and now he could lie in it. But as I looked at him, I saw a broken man, someone who had finally come face to face with the consequences of his actions. It was clear he was desperate, clinging to whatever hope he had left. A small part of me, the part that still remembered the father he used to be, felt a tug of compassion. "What exactly are you asking for?" I asked, my voice cold. He took a shaky breath. "Just if you could see her, maybe talk to her. She's lost in ways I don't understand. And maybe you know what to say." 1,000 thoughts raced through my mind, and none of them made sense. After everything Charlotte had done to me, the last thing I wanted was to play savior. But I also knew what it was like to feel completely alone, with no one to turn to. As much as I wanted to stay angry, I couldn't deny that small part of me that wanted to help, not for Charlotte's sake, but for mine. Maybe this was the only way I could truly put the past behind me. "Fine," I said finally, "but this doesn't mean I forgive either of you." He nodded, his shoulders slumping in relief. "Thank you, Maya. I know this doesn't make up for anything, but thank you." The next day, I found myself walking up the driveway to my father's house, the place that used to be my home. Everything looked the same, but it felt so different, like a shadow of what it used to be. I hesitated at the door. memories flooding back, but I pushed them aside and knocked. My father opened the door, giving me a tired smile. "She's upstairs," he said quietly, leading me inside. The house was cold, empty, a shell of the home I remembered. It was eerie, seeing the life drained out of the place I'd once known so well. I followed him upstairs, and he gestured toward a room at the end of the hall. I recognized it immediately, my old room. A pang of resentment stabbed at me, but I swallowed it down and stepped inside. Charlotte lay on the bed, her face pale and hollow. She looked up as I entered, her eyes widening in surprise. For a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of shame in her gaze, but it disappeared just as quickly, replaced by something harder to read. "Maya," she said softly, her voice weak. I didn't think. I didn't think you'd come." I crossed my arms, keeping my distance. "I didn't come for you. I came because I don't want to carry this anger around anymore. I needed to see if you were worth forgiving." She looked down, her hands trembling slightly. "I know I've hurt you, and I know I don't deserve anything from you, but I wanted you to know that I'm sorry. For everything." Her apology hung in the air, and I felt the weight of it settle on me. Part of me wanted to believe her, to let her words heal the wounds she'd left. But I also knew that some scars ran too deep to be erased with a few words. "You made my life a nightmare, Charlotte," I said, my voice steady. "You took everything from me and convinced my own father to turn his back on me. Do you have any idea what that did to me?" She nodded, her eyes filling with tears. "I know, Maya. I thought. I thought if I could just erase you, things would be easier. I was selfish and cruel, and I see that now. I see how much I've hurt you." I stared at her, searching her face for any sign of sincerity. I didn't know if I could believe her, if I could trust that she actually felt remorse. But I also knew that holding on to the anger was only hurting me. Maybe it was time to let go, even if that didn't mean forgiving her. "I don't know if I'll ever forgive you," I said slowly, "but I'm not going to let you keep hurting me. I'm done carrying this around." She nodded, looking down, and for the first time, I thought I saw a glimmer of understanding in her eyes. "I don't expect forgiveness, Maya. I just, I wanted you to know that I'm sorry." I took a deep breath, feeling a strange sense of relief wash over me. I didn't have to forgive her, didn't have to welcome her back into my life. But I could walk away, free from the weight of everything she'd done. I could choose my own path, separate from the pain she'd caused. As I turned to leave, my father stepped into the doorway, his eyes filled with a mixture of hope and sadness. "Maya, thank you for giving us a chance to make things right." I looked at him, my heart heavy but resolute. "You had your chance, Dad, and you chose her over me. I don't know if I can ever trust you again, but I'm done letting this define me." He nodded, a tear slipping down his cheek. "I understand. And I'm sorry, Maya, for everything." I walked out of the room, out of the house, and didn't look back. As I stepped into the cool air, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders, a sense of freedom I hadn't known in years. I was finally free of them, free of the pain they'd caused. And as I walked away, I knew I was walking toward a future that was entirely my own. As I walked away from my father's house for the last time, I felt lighter than I had in years. It was as though I'd finally cut the cord that had tied me to a life full of pain, betrayal, and regret. I had spent so long trying to heal from wounds that had been inflicted by people who were supposed to protect me. Now I knew I didn't need their apologies or validation to move forward. I had my own strength, and that was enough. The weeks after that visit were transformative. I focused on my life with a new energy, throwing myself into my classes at the community center and my job at the diner. Carla noticed the change in me almost immediately. "You've got a new spark, Maya," she said one evening as we were closing up. "I don't know what's changed, but whatever it is, hold on to it." I smiled, feeling a warmth spread through me. I think I finally let go of something that was holding me back. She nodded, her eyes filled with pride. "I'm glad. You deserve to be happy, Maya. You've worked hard to get here." Her words stayed with me as I walked home, replaying over and over in my mind. I realized that I was no longer just surviving. For the first time in a long time, I was living, shaping a life that was mine alone, free from the ghosts of my past. I had a long way to go, but each step forward felt like a victory. At the community center, I signed up for more classes, determined to learn everything I could. I took courses in computer skills, business basics, and even a few creative writing workshops. Each class felt like another brick in the foundation of the future I was building, a life that was finally on my own terms. One day, I was sitting in a community center's small library, reviewing some notes on customer service skills, when an idea struck me. I had always loved organizing things, setting up routines and systems to make life run smoothly. What if I could make a career out of that? What if I could start my own business, helping others create order out of chaos? The thought was exhilarating. I spent hours that night researching small businesses, learning about how people had started from scratch and built something they were passionate about. The idea of running my own business seemed daunting, but it also felt right. For the first time, I could see a future where I wasn't just working to get by, I was working towards something that truly mattered to me. I mentioned the idea to Carla one evening, hesitant but hopeful. I know it sounds a little crazy, but I've been thinking about starting a business. Maybe something with organizing or life management, helping people get their lives in order. To my surprise, Carla's face lit up. Maya, that's a wonderful idea. I can see you doing that, helping people find balance and structure. You've been doing it here, in a way, helping me keep the diner running smoothly. Her encouragement gave me the push I needed. I started mapping out ideas, jotting down notes in a notebook I carried everywhere. I wrote down potential services I could offer, the types of clients I could help, even some initial budget estimates. Each note, each idea, felt like a step closer to a life I could truly call my own. The more I planned, the more my confidence grew. I was no longer that scared girl who had been thrown out of her home. I was someone new, someone who had survived the worst and come out stronger. And with every passing day, I felt the anger and bitterness toward my father and Charlotte fade, replaced by a sense of calm and determination. One evening, as I sat in my tiny apartment, surrounded by notes and sketches for my future business, I felt a surge of pride. I had created this life for myself, brick by brick, choice by choice. I didn't need anyone else's approval or acceptance. I was enough just as I was. Over the next few months, I started building my business. It was a slow process, but I took each step with care, reaching out to people in my community, offering my services for free or at a low cost to get started. Word spread slowly, but it spread. Soon, I had a few regular clients, a young mom who needed help organizing her home, an elderly couple who wanted assistance with paperwork and decluttering, a small business owner who needed help managing inventory. Each client taught me something new, not just about organization, but about people, about resilience. I saw bits of myself in each of them, the desire for stability, for control over their lives, for a sense of peace. And with each successful job, my confidence grew. I was making a difference, however small, and it filled me with a sense of purpose I had never known before. My business wasn't just about earning a living, it was about giving people the tools to create lives they could be proud of. And in a way, it was my way of taking back control over my own life, of proving that I could build something beautiful out of the broken pieces I'd been left with. One evening, Carla invited me to her home for dinner, a gesture that touched me more than I could express. She'd become a mentor, a friend, someone who believed in me even when I doubted myself. As we sat around her cozy kitchen table, she looked at me with a proud smile. "You've come a long way, Maya," she said, raising her glass in a toast. "Here's to new beginnings, to second chances, and to you, for finding the strength to build your own life." Her words brought tears to my eyes, and I raised my glass, feeling a warmth and gratitude that went beyond words. For so long, I had felt abandoned, lost. But now I realized that I wasn't alone. I had people who cared about me, who believed in me, and most importantly, I had started to believe in myself. As the months turned into years, my business grew. I moved out of my tiny apartment into a small but comfortable space of my own, a place filled with light and warmth, a true home. I continued my education, taking more classes and expanding my skill set, always striving to improve, to grow. And though my father occasionally reached out, sending brief texts or the occasional letter, I chose not to respond. I had made my peace, and I didn't need his approval or his guilt to validate the life I'd created. I knew he regretted his choices, but that was a burden he would have to carry on his own. I had forgiven him in my heart, but I didn't need him to be part of my future. Instead, I focused on the people who were there for me, who supported me through every step of my journey. Carla became a lifelong friend, a constant presence in my life, and we often laughed about those early days at the diner, about how far I'd come. And my clients became like family, each one teaching me something new, each one reminding me of the power of resilience, of hope. Looking back, I could hardly believe how much my life had changed. I had gone from a scared, lost teenager to a confident, independent woman, someone who had built a life she could be proud of. My past no longer defined me. It was simply a part of my story, a reminder of how far I'd come. One day, as I sat in my office, looking out at the city that had become my home, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. I had found my place in the world, my purpose. And though the journey had been painful, filled with moments of despair and doubt, I knew I wouldn't change a thing. Every hardship, every tear, every moment of darkness had led me here to a life filled with hope, strength, and unshakable resilience. And as I turned back to my work, I knew that whatever the future held, I was ready. I had faced the worst, and I had come out stronger. I was free in every way that mattered. Years passed, and my life blossomed into something I had never dreamed possible. My business thrived, growing from a small organizing service into a full-fledged consultancy. I'd hired a few employees, people who were just as passionate as I was about bringing order and peace into people's lives. I'd even started teaching workshops at the community center, sharing the skills I'd spent years honing. Life was full, busy, and filled with purpose, and every day I woke up feeling grateful for the journey that had brought me here. I hadn't heard from my father in over a year. The last message he sent was brief, almost cryptic. "I hope you're well, Maya. I think about you every day." I'd read it, felt a flicker of something close to sadness, and put it aside. I wasn't angry with him anymore, but I also wasn't willing to let him back into my life. I had moved on, built something strong and beautiful from the wreckage of our past, and I didn't see the point in reopening old wounds. Then, one evening as I was wrapping up a workshop, my phone buzzed with a call from an unknown number. Normally, I wouldn't answer, but something compelled me to pick up. "Hello," I said, balancing my phone on my shoulder as I gathered up my notes. There was a pause on the other end, followed by a familiar voice. "Maya, it's your father." I froze, the world around me falling silent. I hadn't expected this, hadn't prepared for the wave of emotions that surged up, memories that I thought I'd buried long ago. "Dad," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Yes," he replied, his voice thick with something I couldn't quite place. "I know it's been a long time. I didn't want to call, but things have changed." I felt a pang of irritation mixed with concern. "What's going on?" He hesitated, and I could almost picture him struggling to find the right words. I I don't have much time left, Maya. I'm sick. The doctors, they say it's terminal." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I'd imagine him reaching out for all sorts of reasons, but never this. I'm I'm sorry to hear that." I managed, feeling my voice tremble. "But I don't know what you want from me, Dad. We haven't spoken in years." "I know," he said, and I could hear the regret in his voice. "And I don't deserve anything from you. But I had to try. I had to see if there's any way we could make peace before it's too late." I took a deep breath, grappling with the whirlwind of emotions swirling inside me. Part of me wanted to hang up, to protect the life I'd built, but another part, the part that still remembered the father he'd once been, hesitated. I had made peace with my past, but hearing him now, knowing that he was reaching out in his final days, made something in me soften. "When did you find out?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Just a few months ago, he replied, sounding weary. I didn't want to tell you like this. I wanted to, I don't know, try to rebuild something first. But there's no time left. I closed my eyes, feeling a surge of sadness for the man he'd become, for the life he'd wasted on choices he couldn't undo. Where are you? I asked finally. He gave me the name of the hospital, and before I knew it, I'd agreed to visit him the next day. As I hung up, I felt a strange sense of calm settle over me. I didn't know if I was ready for this, but I knew I had to go. Not for him, but for me. The next day, I walked into the hospital with a mixture of dread and determination. When I found his room, he looked up, and the years seemed to melt away. He looked frail, his skin pale and eyes sunken, but there was a flicker of the father I remembered in his gaze. Maya, he said, his voice soft and broken. You came. I nodded, taking a seat by his bed, feeling a strange distance as I looked at him. I'm here, but I don't know what you expect from me, Dad. He sighed, looking down at his hands. I don't expect anything. I just, I wanted to see you one last time, to tell you how sorry I am. I know I failed you, Maya. I know I made mistakes I can never take back. I felt a tightness in my chest, a mixture of anger and sadness that I'd buried for years. You didn't just make mistakes, Dad. You chose her over me. You let her ruin our family, and then you threw me away like I meant nothing. He winced, and I could see the pain in his eyes. I know, and I've spent every day regretting it. I was weak, Maya. I was afraid of being alone, and I let Charlotte manipulate me. But losing you, it broke something in me that I couldn't fix. I looked away, feeling tears prick at my eyes. I'd spent so long wishing for these words, but now that they were here, they felt hollow, too late to mend the damage he'd done. Do you know how hard it was for me? I said, my voice barely a whisper. You left me with nothing, no home, no family. I had to rebuild my entire life from scratch because of you. He nodded, his face filled with shame. I can't undo what I did, Maya, but I'm proud of you. I've followed your life from afar, seen the business you built, the strength you found. You're everything I wish I could have been. The words hung in the air, and I felt a strange sense of peace settle over me. I didn't need his pride or his regret, but hearing him acknowledge my journey gave me a sense of closure I hadn't expected. I don't know if I can forgive you, I said, my voice steady, but I think I can let go of the anger. I don't want to carry it with me anymore. He smiled weakly, his eyes filled with gratitude. That's more than I deserve, Maya. Thank you. I stayed with him for a while, talking about my life, my business, the friends who had become my family. I could see the regret in his eyes, the longing for a life he'd lost through his own choices, but I also saw a glimmer of peace. I knew he was grateful for this small chance to make amends, even if it came at the very end. As I left the hospital that day, I felt lighter, as though a weight I'd carried for years had finally lifted. I'd said my piece, found the closure I needed, and now I was ready to move forward without the shadow of my past holding me back. A few weeks later, my father passed away. I received a small envelope from the hospital with a letter he'd written to me, filled with apologies and memories of happier times when we'd been a family. I read it, letting the words sink in, and then I tucked it away, knowing that it would serve as a reminder of the journey I'd taken, the strength I'd found in the face of loss and betrayal. Life moved on, and so did I. My business continued to grow, and I found joy in the work I did, in the people I helped. I had friends who felt like family, a purpose that filled my days with meaning, and a sense of peace that I'd fought hard to earn. I was no longer defined by the pain of my past, but by the resilience and hope I'd found along the way. One evening, as I sat in my cozy apartment, I looked around at the life I'd built, the life I'd created from nothing. I thought of my father, of Charlotte, of the scars they'd left, and I realized that I'd finally forgiven them. Not for their sake, but for mine. I was free, free to live, to love, to build a future filled with joy and strength. And as I closed my eyes, I felt a warmth spread through me, a quiet, unshakable happiness that came from knowing I'd survived, that I'd found my way home. My journey had been painful, filled with loss and betrayal, but in the end, it had brought me here to a life that was wholly, beautifully mine. And I knew, without a doubt, that I was exactly where I was meant to be.